Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. On my Patreon-supported YouTube channel about Norse language and myth, I often deal with misconceptions that are quite popular about Norse mythology. And in this video, I just want to give you a quick tour through the 6 biggest ones that I encountered. Now, the local buffalo herd has recently had some calves that are pretty cute, so I'm going to show you those from my truck and a few of these. I'm being responsible and not getting out of the truck, right? Got to model good behavior, what have you. But these are wild buffalo, and it's neat to get a nice close look at their lives. Fun little fact, Old Norse does have a word for effectively buffalo. There was a wild roaming animal called the wisent or European bison in pre-modern Europe that looked a lot like and was quite closely related to our American buffalo, and the Old Norse word for that is visundor. All right, we're going to get a close look at some of them for some of these misconceptions, so let's take a look. Thor and Loki are not brothers. This one is so prevalent thanks to the Marvel universe that I've even been quoted as saying it when I've mentioned Thor and Loki. Right, journalists just turn me saying Thor and Loki into the brothers Thor and Loki because they're used to thinking of them as such from Marvel. In fact, Loki is the son of a female being named Laufey and a male being named Thorbauti. Marvel also reverses the mother's name into a father's name. And Thor is the son of Odin and his concubine from among the anti-divinities, or so-called giants, the Jotnar, and his mother is named Jord, meaning simply earth, or probably her more ancient name, Fjorgen. The prose and Poetic Edda are not the same thing. Snorri Sturluson wrote the Prose Edda in about the 1220s, and what this work set out to do was to reintroduce to a culture that was abandoning its traditional Norse forms of poetry in favor of English and French rhyming poetry, the kind of stuff we'd be more used to calling poetry today. He wanted to reintroduce them to the traditional Norse poetic forms involving alliteration and the complicated skaldic meters. And in order to reintroduce those poetic forms, he also had to reintroduce a lot of that poetic language, which made heavy use of allusions and kennings involving the names of the gods and references to their exploits and stories. So the Prose Edda tells as much as Snorri knew about Norse mythology in the 1220s, about 220 years after Iceland was Christianized. And while a lot of that is very solid, and very often he's quoting poems that made it into the Poetic Edda, we don't always know exactly what his sources were because he certainly knew, some poems that did not make it into the Poetic Edda compilation. Now the Poetic Edda is a compilation, or mixtape, I like to say, for people who need that kind of updated reference. It's about 30 poems about the Norse gods and heroes that probably were mostly originally composed in the 900s, just before Iceland was Christianized. They were then passed down orally by people who still appreciated the traditional stories without wanting to pass down the original religion. It's notable that the Eddas include lots of stories about the gods, but no way to pray or worship, and no information about rituals or things like that. The Poetic Edda, thus, is a direct link back to the stories told in pre-Christian times. The Prose Edda is a somewhat secondary link, filtered through Snorri, who certainly understands things as a medieval Christian does. He's trying to kind of make more of a canonical single story than there probably was back then. But we think that Snorri, for the most part, understood his sources quite well, certainly better than we can expect to without him 800 years later. And he didn't just make it up. That's a related misconception, this one that started with a Cracked article saying that Snorri Sturluson made up Norse mythology in the 1200s. That's definitely not true. We have good linguistic reasons to believe that the poems of the Poetic Edda and the other poems Snorri used were in fact pre-Christian in origin. You can pass down poems in a much older stage of the language than the one you actually speak. And that's exactly what happened with the Eddas. It's exactly what's happened with English phrases like "till death do us part," which, if we were to say that in modern English, would be "till death parts us." The Eddas are datable to the pre-Christian period, most of the poems in them anyway. And Snorri was trying his best, although imperfectly, as anyone would, to pass down the traditions of a forgotten, much earlier time. The past has passed, and to Snorri, Norse mythology was already part of a past, but it was a past he was closer to than we are. All right, now let me give you a quick message from my long-suffering sponsor, and then we'll get back to some Buffalo and Norse myth misconceptions. The quote-unquote giants and gods are not different species that look different. This has been encouraged by the Marvel Universe, where the giants are huge humanoids who are blue in color. But in fact, in the Eddas and Sagas, our real medieval sources for Norse myth, the quote-unquote giants, or Jotnar in Old Norse, are beings of the same rough physical stature of the gods and the same physical appearance. In fact, many of them are apparently quite attractive, although some of them are ugly and have weird characteristics like very large numbers of heads. But they are not fundamentally different species. The quote-unquote giants are not blue, and they're not bigger than the gods. The translation that I've preferred in working for the great courses on my new course on Norse mythology for them, for Jotnar, has been, instead of giants, something more along the lines of anti-gods, anti-deities, anti-divinities. I think that emphasizes that they are of a similar stature, both physical and mythic, right? They're an antagonist set of equally powerful supernatural beings who will fight the gods at the end, but until then actually intermarry with them to such an extent that even the major gods such as Odin, Thor, and Tyr are at least half quote-unquote giant, half Jotun. We can't necessarily say anything about every single name that occurs in Norse myth. We don't know if the tree Lærøðr mentioned in Grimnismal as being somewhere above the roof of Valhalla is a separate tree or the same tree as Yggdrasil. We don't know if the tree that Odin sacrificed himself on was Yggdrasil. We don't know who the dwarf Þjóðrerir that Odin mentions in Hávamál was. Unfortunately, there's just no source book, right, or compendium or wiki or something where we can look up every single thing, at least not and have information that actually legitimately comes down to us from the Middle Ages. People today make up a lot of answers for these questions, but the medieval audience either wasn't as interested in solving all these so-called loopholes, or they didn't see them as loopholes and just saw each story as kind of its own self-contained exploration in a wider, if you will, cinematic universe or franchise of Norse myth that doesn't all necessarily fit together as one cohesive canonical whole in the way that we might expect a novel series to in our reading as modern, say, novel readers today. The gods are more personalities than they are roles. The gods are very honest like Thor, or very curious like Odin, or very mischievous like Loki. To call Thor a god of thunder is to misrepresent him as kind of an elemental force, when in fact, reading the Eddas, we get much more of a sense of who he would be if we were to sit down and have a meal with him than we do of any sort of special power over thunder and lightning. Now, Thor is maybe the one who comes closest to meeting the sort of traditional definition here. His name means thunder. Thor is in fact cognate with, from the same root as English thunder. And his hammer, Mjolnir, is probably cognate with a Russian word for lightning. So it's possible that at one point he did have more of an elemental role, and when he shows up for his fight with Hrungnir in the Prose Edda, thunder and lightning show up alongside him. So he's not completely lacking some association with thunder and lightning, but he doesn't really do anything with thunder or lightning per se. He's not a storm god in the kind of elemental way that that makes us think about it today. He is fundamentally this very honest, very hardworking, very concerned with his reputation as a good dranger or example of masculine courage individual, and much less any sort of role. All of this stuff about god of, goddess of gets even less true as you go through the ranks. Loki is not a god of fire. I think the main impetus for that idea starts with Wagner, who has his Loga be a a god of fire, and so that gets into Dungeons and Dragons and all the other fantasy stuff today. Loki has no real association with fire. His name doesn't mean fire or anything like that. Or you end up with goddesses that are barely mentioned at all, like the supposed Sjolven, who Snorri includes in his lists of goddesses, being credited as a goddess of love. If anybody's a goddess of love, it's Freya, who actually does stuff related to love, and who is lusted after by all the gods and anti-gods. Sjolven is never mentioned anywhere, and probably Snorri is just trying to inflate the numbers of goddesses to equal the number of gods and the number of goddesses in the Olympian Greco-Roman religion. Sjolven, if anything, is probably just a kenning or poetic circumlocution for the name of Freya or Frigg. There are many goddesses described by Snorri in one sentence or so, and we mostly think that they are just alternative names, poetic circumlocutions, kennings, heiti, for Freya and Frigg, the goddesses who really do anything in our narratives in the Eddas. Odin is not some kindly grandfather figure as he's often portrayed in popular culture today, such as the Marvel Universe. Odin is instead a very violent, very bloodthirsty, and in fact fairly selfishly motivated figure who knows that he's going to die in Ragnarok, killed by the great wolf Fenrir, and who is trying to gather as many dead warriors to himself as he can in his hall called Valhall in Old Norse, or often known as Valhalla in English, so that he can fight against the wolf and maybe have a chance of surviving. Now, because he needs to gather dead men to himself in Valhall, he goes around the realm of the living and gets men killed. He encourages battle, he encourages manslaughter or murder, as he does in the story of him going to the 9 slaves in the quest for Otherrear. He is a figure that human beings might feel pretty conflicted about, and who even his own son Thor feels fairly conflicted about, to judge from the insults that he and Thor lob at each other in Horbraiðsljóð, the poem where Thor is traveling and he meets his father Odin in the disguise of a ferryman. The gods are not a peaceful family, and it's in fact Thor who's often the force of order, and Odin who is the force of chaos. From beautiful Wyoming, I'm wishing you all the best.